We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we've heard time and time again.
Hello and welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by my esteemed colleagues, John Ferguson, who's the political editor of the Sunday Mail, and also Ben Borland, who is the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. So I think we're about a week away from the Scottish budget, which is probably the main set-piece event in the Scottish Parliament every year. It's when the Cabinet Secretary for Finance lays out the government's tax and spending plans. Obviously, we now have a minority SNP government, so they're going to need the cooperation of another party. The realpolitik of it is that it's going to have to be either the Libe Dems or the Greens, because the Tories and Labour are just not going to ride to the rescue. I don't know what you both think, but it just seems to me that this is not going to be an austerity budget. It's not going to be a cuts budget. So I think that Swinney's going to get it over the line somehow. He needs a couple of abstentions. He doesn't need another party to vote for it. Simply abstaining would be enough. Ben, I mean, the mood music is maybe Lib Dems more than the Greens?
Well, that does seem to be the mood music. I think I said in here 2 weeks ago, I looked into that camera and pleaded with Alex Cole-Hamilton not to back the budget. It doesn't seem to listen to me, so there you go. It does look as though talks continue. I just think it would be an absolute mistake. It would be a real blow for people like myself, who are very, very staunchly pro-United Kingdom, after all this time, to see the Lib Dems supporting the SNP. I mean, I've written a piece for our website. I live in East Dunbartonshire, now Mid Dunbartonshire. I've voted Lib Dem ever since I moved there.
What a bombshell that is.
Tactical voting. I mean, they're not my party of choice. I don't mind some of their policies, but I won't be voting Lib Dem again if they back the SNP. I want to see the SNP government fall and a new election. And Alex Cole-Hamilton says, oh, but there would be emergency measures and public sector workers wouldn't get paid if the budget doesn't pass. We've got till April next year to resolve this. And if they can't pass the budget, we get an election and we get a new government. And you'd think Alex Cole-Hamilton would fancy being part of that government, perhaps alongside Labour, rather than propping up this failing administration that, quite frankly, we've all just about had enough of.
Isn't that irresponsible, though? I mean, this is not about IndyRef 2, this budget. It's about public sector workers getting paid. It's about tax rates.
It's not about IndyRef 2. It's about the fact, the mess the SNP have had their chance. We're on our third First Minister of this term. They've had the chance. It's time for them to go, and the sooner the better. And I think an awful lot of people out there will feel the same, and they will not appreciate.
The opinion polls are looking pretty good for the SNP just now, though. I mean, if that's your goal, which is toppling the SNP and getting a pro-UK administration, then the opinion polls are looking pretty good for John Swinney.
Well, looking okay. I think they're still showing that it could be a hung parliament, which means that a pro-UK alliance will seal the deal. I think. I don't think the Lib Dems, and I wouldn't believe a word the SNP say about taking independence spending out of the budget, because while that sort of slice of cash on the actual planning, the team of 11 civil servants or whatever it might be stopped for a year, in actual fact, the entire government is set up to pursue and promote the cause of Scottish independence. So stopping that won't do a thing to actually derail the SNP. What derails the SNP is getting them out of power, and that should be the goal of all the opposition parties at Holyrood, in my opinion.
I mean, there will be an opportunity, wouldn't there, to get the SNP out of power in 2026, so that the time will come when
the time will come, but I think
we'll get to choose. I think at the moment you've really got to. We need to have a budget passed, and given that the Scottish Government's budget's more or less fixed. There should be the ability for other parties to work with whoever the governing party is to pass something. It does look to me like it's going to be the Lib Dems rather than the Greens at the moment. Just it feels like the demands are less, and of course there's the one thing that Alex Cole-Hamilton seems to be insisting on is that there isn't any spending on independence, which is probably something he's thrown in there to placate people exactly like you.
I think he has, but sorry.
So, and if you know if they're going to do that, then it's like as Paul says, public sector workers need to get paid. I think in actual fact, it's very difficult to force an election in a Scottish Parliament election, and so really think for the country the best thing is that the SNP work with another party to pass a budget and allow the extra money that the Labour Party in London have given for the NHS and everything else to be spent.
Thing is, Ben, it's not. It wouldn't just be voting for one election; it'd be voting for two elections. So if it did collapse, then we get one next year. But the election in 2026 still stands. So do folk really want to?
That can be amended. You know,
there's no suggestion it would be though. I mean, right now it'd be one after the other, back to back.
It would be amended. I mean, the fixed timescales of the Scottish Parliament elections have been amended before, so it can be amended again. I don't think anyone. Again, this is another argument I've seen Alex Cole-Hamilton make. I can't see any circumstances where if there's a snap election next spring, we will be forced to have one just because of a piece of secondary legislation that can be passed by Westminster quite quickly, especially if there's a Labour Scottish Government.
I think what we can maybe all agree on is it doesn't seem like the Greens are going to be sort of the handmaidens of this budget. I mean, they're still sore over the way they were treated and getting kicked out in the manner of their ejection. And it just seems like, if you look at it from the perspective of both the pro-independence parties, it might be in their interests for there to be no deal. You know, the SNP are reaching out to Middle Scotland.
Absolutely.
They would much rather do a deal with the Lib Dems. The Greens are trying to shore up their so-called radicalism. They want to show to their own voters that they can say no to the SNP. So maybe the Lib Dems is the only game in town.
Yeah, well, for the SNP, it gets them off the hook. It means people forget this crazy alliance with the Greens and they go into the next election as a sensible centre-left party, which they haven't been. That's not what they've been doing. It's letting them off the hook. I think it's such a mistake. I really do.
The content of it, we'll have to wait till next week, but I mean, so many of the past budgets have centred around tax rises, particularly income tax rises and other ways of raising revenue. But given the UK budget and the extra Barnett cash that's coming up here in the current year and then 24-25, doesn't seem like it's going to be a tax raising budget. I mean, there might be things on the margins like, I don't know, a cruise tax or a private planes tax, but in terms of the biggies like income tax, that seems to be off the agenda. And just from speaking to the First Minister's advisors, I think they want it to be a good news budget full of pre-election giveaways.
Yeah, I think they've accepted that there is a limit to how much you can keep on increasing tax in Scotland above the rates that you have in England, the rest of the UK. So I don't think that's going to happen. And I do get the impression with regards to the Greens that I think the demands that they've made are just a bit viewed as being a bit pie in the sky. But I think also the thing that eventually the SNP have kind of lost patience with is the fact that these demands have been constantly being made publicly, and it's all been about show and to kind of try to show how radical they are as compared with the Scottish Government. I think eventually they've just grown a bit sick of that process and are looking around for someone that they can negotiate with in a normal way and come to some sort of agreement that works.
I also think as well that all the tax rises on business in the UK budget, I mean, could you really have a situation where after that the Scottish Government then introduces more taxes on top? I mean, one of the things we've been writing about is this idea of higher business rates on supermarkets and shops that sell tobacco and alcohol. Now, the Scottish Government introduced that a few years ago for a number of years and then ended it, but if you've got Tesco's and Asda's already paying national insurance extra contribution to then pile another tax on top of that, it just doesn't feel like it's going to be a tax rising budget.
Well, they've got extra money as well. Is it 1.5 million this year and
3.4
3.4 next year? So there's money that they weren't expecting. So surely it won't be against this background. It can't be a tax raising budget.
And you have to remember that money is coming from tax rises that are going to be hitting Scottish businesses anyway. And as much as, I mean, the thing with those tax rises, where the Labour had said these will be taxes on businesses, not on individuals. But the thing with tax is that ultimately they always trickle down to the individual, because if you put a tax on a business, they increase the prices of their products and all the rest of it. So yeah, it just feels like there isn't really the headroom left to increase tax anymore.
I mean, a really good move from my point of view would be to pass on the rates relief to hospitality businesses, which obviously that's been a major sort of demand for the past 2 years. And given that the UK government have increased national insurance for employers, a lot of bars, a lot of restaurants are having to pay extra through the wage bill, does this give them a little relief by passing this on?
The thing with that, though, is, I mean, like, we all know that if you increase tax on business, they will pass it on to the customer. They will limit pay rises for existing staff, and it will probably inhibit the new staff that they can hire. But, you know, you're talking about the hospitality relief. I mean, is there any sort of evidence that if they did that, that would benefit the customer?
It's not so much benefit the customer, because they'd have more choice of restaurants, hotels, pubs and bars to visit, because
do you feel there isn't enough choice at the moment?
Places are closing. I mean, obviously you walk out of this office in central Glasgow, there are a plethora of places, but you get away from the city centres, a lot of pubs are closing, a lot of restaurants are closing. I think some extra help would be appreciated. Having said that, I almost hope that they don't do it, because again, as far as I'm concerned, anything that keeps this government as unpopular as it is works for me.
Just to go back to your point, though, about having an election, I think the main reason that I don't think that's going to happen is that there's no obvious beneficiaries of that. I mean, if you look at it from Swinney's point of view, okay, he's going to go down in terms of seats, but he might just cling on. There's an outside chance he would cling on
with his
Tories.
New pals, the Lib Dems.
The Tories.
Do Labour want an election to count? I'm not sure that they do.
I think they did 6 months ago.
Yeah, they did. But right now, they want, 18 months of good news from Starmer, not 6 months of bad news. The Tories, it looks like they're going to go down from about 31 to about 16. I mean, of all the parties, it's probably the Greens that would be the keenest for an election, because all the opinion polls show them going up significantly.
Well, I still think there's just a tide of public opinion that now says 17 years is enough. We've got a Labour government. Let's see what, and I'm realistic enough to know that it would have to be a Labour-led government at Holyrood. Let's see what they can do. Let's see what they can do in conjunction with the UK government, because I don't think anyone would argue that Scotland's in that much of a better place than it was in 2007. I really think there's this tide of the voters out there want a change, and the sooner we give them the opportunity to express that, the better.
So you mentioned the next Parliament. We're going to talk about the rise of reform in Scotland, which, although it's a pretty ramshackle organisation up here, they're doing well. So I'm just going to go through some of the stats just now. There was the local by-election in Glasgow North East. They won about 18%. They did less well in the two other wards, but still were pretty impressive. And then there was a Survation poll for Progress Scotland, which has the Ballot Box Scotland website has done an extrapolation in terms of seats, and has Reform, I think, on 14 seats if that came to pass. Now, I mean, I cannot underestimate the impact that 14 Reform MSPs would have in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, I just think that, I mean, I'm looking at the full extrapolation. So it gives the SNP in 38, Labour 36, the Tories 21, the Greens 10, Lib Dems 10, and Reform 14. I think Anas Sarwar would be First Minister in those circumstances, but it would just be an ungovernable parliament. It'd be a crazy gang parliament.
Well, it kind of feels, doesn't it, that increasingly, if that happens, that there would need to be some kind of coalition of centre-left parties, and the only deal that would potentially work there is a deal between Labour and the SNP. That's obviously extremely unpalatable to both parties. I think probably less for the SNP, but it does feel that if you have this, I mean, really, it's the Scottish Parliament kind of balancing out as it was supposed to be in the beginning, wasn't it? Where it was going to be a parliament of coalitions, and if you've got this new thing, Reform, which, I mean, it's kind of inexplicable in a way. It's a party that's built pretty much entirely around the immigration debate. Now, in Scotland, immigration has been far less significant than it has been elsewhere in the UK, and it's also the case that I don't think any serious economist will not tell you that immigration is really important to the Scottish economy. So we need people coming in and working here and paying tax, and yet we could see, there's a real chance that they're going to make a considerable impact, and if the effect that has, that you have this parliament where the Tories, the Lib Dems, the SNP, Labour and Reform are all doing quite well, to have a government that works will probably require two of the more significant parties to work together. The only two parties that you can really see having that kind of relationship, as odd as it sounds, would be Labour and the SNP.
I'm just looking at the seat breakdown, and the only two parties that I think that could get a majority if they work together are the SNP and Labour. There's no other two-party combination that works. So for a budget, you need three parties. Any legislation, you need three parties. If the SNP and Labour just continue to refuse to work with each other, so and then I mean it's. I
think we were discussing this before the programme started, and Reform are kind of the disruptors. I know their key policy is immigration, but it's not. It's more a vote to say, I'm really not happy with the way things are. I don't like the system. I don't like how things are set up. I just want to take the apple cart over. They're kind of in the same way that a lot of the vote for Trump in the States was just like, I do not like how things are. I want it to change. I think that's what's driving the Reform vote. I don't think it's immigration. I think it's people going, I don't like this system. I want it to change.
It's people who've been left behind and feel forgotten about.
Well, they've been left behind and forgotten, but also just don't like the way things work at the moment. So for Reform, this kind of crazy gang parliament might work. They could, and that is how parliaments around the world work, issue by issue basis.
I think it's also got a lot to do with this idea of the war on woke, and
the war on woke, absolutely, cultural issues,
and actually a lot of the people that are very exercised by that stuff tend to be quite wealthy, middle class people who just feel that something's happening in the world.
What you need for Reform? J.K. Rowling backed Reform, and then suddenly all bets are off. I mean, they kind of remind me in a way of how the SNP were when Salmon actually came to power. In this sort of, the message is, we've tried this for decades. Let's try something new.
Yeah, anti-establishment.
Anti-establishment. That's the phrase I was looking for. And I mean, Kevin McKenna in the Herald recently suggested that if we do keep going to 2026 and the polls keep going, we could actually see a Tory Reform coalition government at Holyrood. That's
I think we're a wee bit.
But from 0 to 14 in what, 3 or 4 months, if it keeps going this way.
If you look at the general elections, no doubt they shafted the Tories. Tories promised cuts in immigration. That didn't happen. I think that was one of the main drivers behind Reform's rise. But speaking to Labour people, and they feel like their own party is now losing votes to Reform as well. And when John Prescott died, I can't stand Farage, but he gave a very, very shrewd speech in the House of Commons about Prescott, saying that he shows that there's a need for more working class voices like Prescott, and really paying tribute to him. And I just felt at that moment that Farage and his party are explicitly reaching out to disaffected Labour voters as well, whereas maybe they were just going for the anti-immigration Tory vote. So, my view is that reform will eventually fizzle out, but it's not going to be in time for the 2026 Holyrood election. They're going to get MSPs elected for the first time.
I think they're also taking voters from the SNP. I mean, Alex Neil said in a piece today that making the point you made about how they're connecting with working class Scottish voters.
That's it. If you're going for that anti-establishment vote, then the SNP are
right for the picking.
For the picking, and I mean it's a shame, because I think as much as you might have misgivings about the SNP, there is, as much as they're anti-establishment in the sense that they want to break up the United Kingdom, there is behind that a fairly decent left of centre political philosophy that they have tried to implement in Scotland, and certainly in their earlier years they implemented quite successfully. I think the thing about reform is that it's unclear at the moment whether there's really anything much behind that idea of just trying to stoke up resentment and anger in the population at the way things are. It's unclear whether there's any reasonable alternative that they're putting forward.
No, I don't think there is. I think it is just an empty protest vote.
It's a wrecking ball. I mean, I think that the Scottish Parliament would be under huge pressure as an institution with reform in it. It's not quite like UKIP and Farage being in the European Parliament, where their number one goal is to abolish or take the UK out of the EU. I mean, I think that reform have said that they don't want to abolish the Scottish Parliament, but they could end up with that position, and they could just end up undermining everything about the institution. So I think that if the other parties are not fully cognizant and aware of these dangers, then they should be, and fast, because it's going to be very difficult to get anything through whatsoever in a parliament that has reform in such strong numbers, and the SNP and Labour are not talking to each other. The institution could break down.
Essentially neocons, aren't they? That's the thing behind the sort of really exterior that's trying to reach out to working class voters. Things are basically, I think, a party that would be very interested in privatising the NHS and severely diminishing the welfare state, and basically doing away with regulations that, as much as they're derided every now and again, actually keep people safe and keep society functioning.
Yeah, I just think if we do get 40, I don't think it's going to have that dramatic an effect. I think you have to go on to a system of government that other countries use, and obviously the Scottish Parliament, so it's a devolved administration. Scotland will still function if Holyrood breaks down. Northern Ireland carried on quite happily after Stormont, didn't work for several years. So things will still happen, and I think you've got to respect the votes of reform voters. They have this point of view, and they're entitled to it. And I think it's maybe a reflection of the way devolved Scotland has been run. People are so sick of it that they feel like, I'm going to vote for this party that has no policies just because I don't like how the country's going at the moment.
If you know what the candidate's going to be, because whenever reform select candidates, they tend to be horrible people with horrible views.
And that's if they're real.
And that's if they are actually proper candidates, not paper candidates living in the southeast of England. So,
well, I don't know. I mean, I spoke to a couple of the reform candidates in the general election. Said they seemed like reasonable people. The deputy leader was a nationalist, voted yes in the referendum. I had a long chat with him. He was a perfectly nice bloke. Maybe Reform Scotland attracts a different...
Does he still support independence?
He said he wouldn't, but he wouldn't rule it out in the future. He said, I wouldn't vote yes if there was another. But largely because of the mess the SNP had made in running the country. I think you put him down as an undecided.
So I think that probably wraps it up. So next week, budget, who knows? Maybe an election after that, but I'm not putting my money on it. I'm still thinking that the next Holyrood election will be in 2026. So I hope you've enjoyed the latest issue of Planet Holyrood. You can tune in on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, all the usual formats, and I hope you join us again next week.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.